Have you ever wondered how one city could feel like a complete world unto itself, with hills, temples, baths, streets, stories, and emperors layered one upon another? Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll move slowly through Rome, taking our time with its long memory, its quiet stone, and the many small details that still seem to linger there. This is not a hurried visit. It is a gentle, listening journey through the city that grew from a riverside beginning into the center of an empire, and then into a place where so much of the past still rests in view. If you enjoy these calm travels, you are always welcome to like the video, subscribe for more quiet documentaries, or leave a soft comment about where you're listening from tonight, or what ancient place you might like to explore next. For now, let the room dim a little in your imagination. Let the sounds around you become softer. Picture warm stone, slow footsteps, distant water, and evening light settling over old streets. We'll begin with Rome as a living place, and then we'll let its history unfold gradually, one calm detail at a time. Rome is traditionally said to have been founded in 753 BCE, though historians usually treat that date as a carefully preserved traditional marker rather than a simple factual timestamp. The story belongs to the world of memory as much as to the world of archaeology. Romulus and Remus, the twin figures at the center of Rome's origin myth, were said to have been abandoned, rescued, and tied to the beginnings of the city in a way that blends family drama, divine favor, and political symbolism. Like many foundation stories, it offers more than chronology. It explains why the city mattered, why it was believed to have a special destiny, and why later Romans felt that their past carried the shape of something larger than ordinary settlement. Yet even before that legendary date, the region around the Tiber River was already inhabited by small farming communities, modest villages, and people living practical lives among hills and low marshy ground. There were paths to follow, crossings to defend, and trade routes to watch. Rome did not begin as a marble capital or a disciplined imperial center. It began as a useful place where geography quietly encouraged people to stay. That ordinary beginning is one of the reasons the city remains so compelling. It rose from necessity first, and only later became a symbol. The 7 hills of Rome are among the best-known features of the city's landscape, though in daily life they would have felt less like a single grand panorama and more like a series of separate elevations connected by paths, shrines, houses, and open spaces. The hills are the Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal. Their importance came not only from their height, but from the way each one gathered meaning over time. Some became associated with early settlement and domestic life, while others came to carry political or religious weight. The Palatine, for example, became linked with elite residence and eventually imperial presence. The Capitoline, with its temple to Jupiter, came to stand at the center of Roman civic religion. In a city like Rome, topography was never just scenery. It was memory made visible. A hill could protect, divide, honor, or announce power. To imagine Rome from above is to see how elevation and identity can become intertwined, so that a place feels destined simply because it rises where it does. The Tiber River shaped Rome in quiet but decisive ways. It offered water, movement, and access to trade, but it also demanded caution, because rivers are never purely generous. They nourish a settlement and threaten it at the same time. Early Rome benefited from a crossing point that made it easier to link inland routes with the sea, allowing goods and people to pass through a changing landscape. This made the city more than a cluster of homes on hills. It became a place of meeting, where merchants, travelers, and news could arrive from different directions. The river also served as a natural boundary, something that could be watched and used in the organization of the city. In later centuries, when Rome expanded far beyond its beginnings, the Tiber remained part of its identity even as bridges, embankments, and larger urban structures transformed the setting around it. It is easy to focus on emperors, marble, and military triumphs, but rivers often begin the story more quietly. The Tiber helped make Rome practical before it became glorious. Before Rome became the center of a republic and later an empire, it was shaped by the peoples around it, especially the Etruscans and the Greeks. The Etruscans contributed elements of religion, symbols of authority, and aspects of urban and ceremonial life, while Greek culture offered artistic, literary, and architectural models that Romans adapted in their own distinct way. Rome did not develop in isolation, and that may be one of the deepest reasons for its strength. It borrowed, revised, and absorbed. It did not always invent from nothing, but it excelled at turning inherited forms into something durable and Roman. This habit of adaptation became one of its defining features. Even the gods, rituals, and public ceremonies of Rome show signs of blending and reinterpretation. A Roman temple might preserve older patterns while serving new civic purposes. A Roman idea might arrive through contact and then be made into part of a broader identity. To understand Rome well is to understand that its greatness was built not on purity, but on contact, imitation, and the patient accumulation of borrowed excellence. The Roman Forum was the civic heart of the city, a place where politics, law, religion, commerce, and ceremony overlapped in a way that feels almost impossible to separate from the modern point of view. In its busiest periods, the Forum would have been crowded with senators, litigants, priests, merchants, messengers, and ordinary citizens moving through a shared public space. It was not only monumental, it was functional. It held the everyday business of a great city in a concentrated form. Temples stood near speaking platforms. Legal disputes mingled with social encounters. Public memory and practical routine lived side by side. Today, the Forum appears as fragments of columns, foundations, and broken stone, but its original life was defined by interaction. It was a place where Rome could see itself speaking, judging, bargaining, and remembering in public. Roman civic life was often less compartmentalized than modern life tends to be, and the Forum reminds us that a city can organize itself around gathering rather than separation. In its ruins, the space still feels quietly occupied by conversation. The Colosseum, more properly called the Flavian Amphitheatre, is one of Rome's most recognizable structures, and it reveals the Romans' ability to build on a vast scale with remarkable confidence. Opened in the 1st century CE, it could host large crowds for spectacles that included gladiatorial contests, animal hunts, and staged performances. The building was not merely a venue. It was also a political instrument, shaped by emperors who understood that public entertainment could express generosity, power, and control at the same time. Its architecture combined practicality and spectacle, vaulted passages, efficient crowd movement, tiered seating, and a design meant to handle enormous pressure without collapsing into confusion. Seen quietly today, the Colosseum is not only a symbol of violence, though violence was part of its history. It is also a monument to organization, to engineering, and to the Roman talent for making vast public gatherings feel orderly. Even in ruin, it still suggests a space where many voices once rose together, where the architecture itself was built to manage the energy of a crowd. Roman roads are so famous that the phrase has almost become proverbial, yet their importance is easy to underestimate. These roads were not simply straight lines on a map. They were part of a larger system of administration, movement, and control that helped bind together a very large world. Built with layered foundations and carefully engineered surfaces, Roman roads supported armies, officials, merchants, and travelers. They also reflected Roman confidence in distance and order. A road in the Roman world was a practical declaration that a place could be reached, supplied, and governed. Milestones marked distance. Bridges crossed difficult ground. Way stations gave travelers a sense of continuity along the route. Even after the empire changed, many of these roads remained useful for centuries because they had been built with such care. The legacy of the roads is quieter than that of the Colosseum, but perhaps more transformative. They carried the daily life of a civilization, messages, supplies, troops, and the slow movement of people across the landscape. Much of Roman power traveled on those hard, deliberate lines. Aqueducts gave Rome one of its most impressive and dependable forms of public infrastructure. They brought water from distant sources into the city through channels, tunnels, and arches, feeding fountains, baths, gardens, and households. The system was not magic, though it can feel magical to modern viewers because of its scale and precision. Roman engineers understood gradients, materials, maintenance, and the importance of moving water steadily over great distances. They worked within a culture that valued visible public benefit, so the aqueducts were not only useful but expressive. They showed that Rome could gather resources from far away and bring them into a shared urban life. Water was comfort, hygiene, prestige, and power all at once. The great arches that survive today are not merely beautiful ruins. They are reminders that Rome's beauty often came from practical intelligence applied patiently and at scale. An aqueduct was an elegant answer to a basic human need, and in that simplicity lies much of its enduring grace. Roman baths were among the most social and atmospheric places in the city. They were not just places to wash, but spaces for exercise, conversation, reading, rest, and leisurely routine. A bathhouse could include hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunges, changing areas, and exercise yards, all arranged to support a long visit. The experience was communal, with people moving through the same broad sequence of spaces, even if social differences remained real. The baths reveal something important about Roman daily life. Comfort was not treated as a private luxury only, but as something that could be organized on a civic scale. Heat systems, water supply, and spatial design all worked together to create a public environment of unusual sophistication. In the imagination, one can almost sense the soft echo of footsteps on stone, the shifting sound of water in basins, and the low murmur of conversation under vaulted ceilings. Baths were places of bodily routine, but also of social presence. They made everyday life feel ceremonial without making it solemn. At the center of Roman identity stood a constant tension between tradition and change. Romans often described themselves as guardians of ancestral custom, yet they were also remarkably adaptable. Their political institutions shifted over time, their religious practices absorbed new forms, and their empire widened their cultural horizon. This dual nature is part of what made Rome so durable. It could present itself as stable while changing gradually underneath. That flexibility allowed the city to grow from local power into Mediterranean dominance without losing the language of continuity. Even the myths of Rome, with their kings, heroes, and sacred beginnings, were told and retold to meet the needs of later generations. History became a kind of living conversation about what should remain and what could evolve. In that sense, Rome was not only a city of stone and law. It was a city of adaptation, where the old could be preserved by being carefully revised. The result was a civilization that often seemed rooted in permanence while always moving, almost imperceptibly, into something new. The Roman Republic developed after the end of the monarchy, traditionally dated to 509 BCE, and it created a political system that relied on shared offices, annual elections, and the idea that power should be limited by custom and law. In practice, of course, Roman politics could be tense, competitive, and deeply unequal, but the republican ideal mattered greatly. It gave Romans a language for legitimacy and restraint. Consuls, senators, tribunes, and assemblies all played roles in a structure that attempted to prevent any single person from dominating too easily. The Republic was not democracy in the modern sense, yet it did distribute authority in ways that were complex and influential. Its institutions would later become a model for later generations who admired Rome's public discipline and its balance of ambition with civic form. The rhythm of republican life was also deeply seasonal and procedural. Offices changed hands, debates repeated, and public business moved through familiar channels, giving the city a sense of ordered motion even when political struggle was intense beneath the surface. For Romans, the Republic was not simply a government. It was a habit of thinking about power, one that linked honor to service and public office to the memory of earlier generations. The Senate was one of the most enduring institutions of Roman political life. It was an advisory body in theory, though in practice it held great prestige and influence, especially in matters of foreign policy, finance, and long-term direction. Senators came largely from elite families, and their authority rested not only on office but on status, memory, and tradition. To sit in the Senate was to inhabit a world of continuity, where family lineage and public service were closely linked. The building of the Senate changed over time, but the body itself remained a symbol of Roman order. Even when emperors later overshadowed republican institutions, the Senate continued to exist, adapted to a new reality. That endurance is part of Rome's history. Institutions rarely vanished all at once. They often survived in altered form, carrying echoes of an earlier age. The chamber itself would have been familiar in atmosphere rather than luxurious in the modern sense, formal, crowded with precedent, and shaped by ritual speech. Even silence had meaning there. The Senate was a place where memory and authority met, and where old families could present themselves as guardians of the state, even as the city around them changed. Roman citizenship was highly valued because it provided legal standing, protections, and a sense of belonging to the civic body. Over time, citizenship could be extended beyond the city itself, eventually reaching many communities across Italy and then much of the empire. This expansion was both practical and strategic. By sharing citizenship, Rome created loyalty and incorporated new populations into its system. At first, the concept distinguished insiders from outsiders with sharp clarity, but as the state grew, that boundary widened. Citizenship became one of Rome's great tools of integration. It was not just a label. It shaped inheritance, legal rights, military obligations, and political identity. The gradual spread of citizenship across the Roman world shows how power can be made more durable when it is paired with inclusion, even if that inclusion is incomplete by modern standards. In daily life, citizenship could affect access to courts, protection from certain punishments, and the dignity with which a person was treated by officials. It also carried a psychological weight. To be a citizen was to be part of Rome's story, to stand inside a legal and moral framework that linked a person to a larger civic order stretching far beyond the city's walls. The Roman family, or familia, was much broader than the modern idea of a household. It included not only parents and children, but also enslaved people, dependents, and the wider structure of authority centered on the paterfamilias, the male head of household. Roman family life was therefore both intimate and hierarchical. Homes were places of care, ritual, labor, and discipline. Ancestors mattered greatly, and family memory was preserved through portraits, funerary customs, and stories of lineage. Roman society often turned private life into a public extension of moral identity. The household was where values were formed and displayed. In a calm sense, this meant that Roman domestic life was never merely background. It was one of the engines of the city's social order, connecting daily routines to larger ideas of duty, inheritance, and name. Children learned manners, religion, and social expectations within the household before they ever entered public life. Meals, greetings, and morning visits all followed patterns that reinforced family position and social obligation. The family was a miniature version of the Roman world, ordered, unequal, and deeply concerned with continuity. Even grief was organized through ritual, as if the household itself were a vessel carrying memory from one generation to the next. Roman houses ranged from modest apartments or rented rooms to elaborate domus with atriums, courtyards, and decorative wall paintings. A wealthy house often opened inward rather than outward, with a central atrium that gathered light and rainwater, and an inner garden or peristyle that created a sense of space and freshness. Walls might be painted with scenes of myth, architecture, or delicate patterns. Floors could be paved with mosaics. These homes were not simply places to sleep. They were expressions of status and hospitality, and they turned architecture into a form of social language. Even the arrangement of rooms could communicate rank, ritual, and access. The Roman house remains especially evocative because it brings the ancient world down to human scale. Beyond emperors and armies, there were meals, lamps, courtyards, and the quiet management of ordinary life. In the evening, oil lamps would flicker against painted walls, and the smell of cooking, plaster, or damp stone might linger in narrow corridors. Wealthier homes could feel almost theatrical, with carefully framed views and spaces designed to impress visitors while preserving privacy for the family within. Archaeology at places like Pompeii has made these interiors especially vivid, though the surviving remains are only a partial glimpse of a much larger world of lived-in rooms, worn thresholds, and daily movement. Roman food was shaped by class, geography, and season. Common ingredients included bread, olives, wine, legumes, vegetables, fish, and porridge-like dishes, while elite banquets could include richer fare, elaborate courses, and carefully staged dining rituals. Much of Roman eating was practical and repetitive, but food also had symbolic value. Meals marked friendship, status, and religious observance. The famous Roman appetite for sauces and seasoning, especially garum, a fermented fish sauce, reminds us that ancient cuisines often depended on flavors that might surprise modern palates. Food was preserved, transporting, and adapted to regional supply. Because Rome controlled so much territory, its tables could reflect ingredients from across the Mediterranean. A Roman meal, therefore, offers a quiet map of exchange. It tells us what was grown, traded, valued, and shared, often more honestly than grand political statements do. Bread from grain markets, oil from distant groves, wine from local vineyards, and fish from coastal waters all came together in ordinary households and banquet halls alike. Meals could be simple and nourishing, or slow and ceremonial, with couches, conversation, and the measured pace of dining turning nourishment into a social ritual. Even in modest homes, food linked the household to empire through supply routes, taxation, and the labor of farmers, traders, millers, and cooks. Roman clothing also carried meaning. The toga, perhaps the most iconic garment associated with Roman citizenship, was formal, cumbersome, and highly symbolic. It was not worn constantly, but when it appeared, it signaled public identity, status, and participation in civic life. Tunics were more common in daily wear, and differences in fabric, border, and style could suggest rank or office. Clothing in Rome was never just about comfort. It was a visible code. Even the famous purple dye associated with power carried a strong sense of expense and exclusivity. Roman clothing culture reminds us that public identity was often performed through appearance. To see a Roman in a statue or fresco is to enter a world where garments help define the relationship between the individual and the city. The toga itself was difficult to wear, requiring skill and perhaps assistance, which made it as much a statement as a garment. In contrast, simpler tunics allowed movement and labor, belonging more naturally to everyday life. Material choices, stitching, color, and ornament all communicated something about age, rank, gender, and occasion. In a society so attentive to public life, even cloth became part of the language of hierarchy and belonging. Roman religion was deeply woven into civic life. The gods were not distant abstractions, but active presences in public ritual, household devotion, and the marking of time. Temples, sacrifices, festivals, omens, and priesthoods formed a network of practice that linked divine favor to the health of the state. Romans were often less concerned with exclusive belief than with correct observance. In their worldview, ritual precision mattered. A prayer said properly, a sacrifice made at the right moment, or an omen interpreted with care could all carry political importance. This made religion part of administration as well as devotion. The city's sacred spaces were therefore not merely decorative. They were functional, anchoring Roman life in a sense that the gods and the state remained entangled. The calm regularity of ritual was one of the city's oldest rhythms. Religion could be public and collective, with crowds gathering for festivals, or private and domestic, with offerings made at household shrines. Gods were present at crossroads, in kitchens, in forums, and in the details of language and timing. For Romans, piety was often less about inward feeling than about maintaining a reliable relationship with divine forces through action, repetition, and respect for inherited forms. The Vestal Virgins occupied a unique place in Roman society as priestesses of Vesta, guardian of the sacred fire. Their service was closely watched, highly honored, and bound by strict rules of purity and discipline. They preserved the flame that symbolized the continuity of Rome itself. Their presence reminds us that Roman religion included forms of female authority, though within rigid and exceptional limits. The Vestals lived under formal expectations that set them apart from ordinary women and ordinary priests alike. Their role was both ceremonial and symbolic, and their honor was matched by severe consequences if vows were broken. The fire they guarded was not a mere technical detail. It was a civic metaphor, a living emblem of endurance. In the stillness of a documentary moment, the image of that flame can feel almost like the city breathing softly in the dark. Their house near the Forum was associated with sacred duty and public trust, and the Vestals could enjoy unusual privileges, though always within the narrow frame of their office. The long years of service, the careful maintenance of the flame, and the aura of ritual purity made them some of the most recognizable figures in Roman memory. They stand at the boundary between religion, politics, and myth, where symbolism becomes part of the city's daily life. Augury, the interpretation of signs from birds and other omens, played an important role in Roman public life. The idea was not simple superstition in the modern sense, but part of a structured attempt to read divine approval or disapproval before important action. Officials could delay, repeat, or reshape decisions based on auspicious signs. This practice blended religion, politics, and ritual expertise. It also shows how deeply Romans felt the need to place human action in conversation with a wider cosmic order. The sky could matter as much as the Senate chamber. Whether viewed as belief, performance, or social structure, augury reveals a civilization that paid close attention to pattern. In a city so intensely organized, even uncertainty had its procedures, and even the invisible could be consulted before a step was taken. Birds in flight, their direction, their number, and their behavior could all be read as part of an inherited system of meaning. Such practices helped Romans feel that decisions were not made in isolation. They were made within a world that could respond, warn, or approve. In that sense, augury gave form to doubt, turning ambiguity into ritual and allowing public life to proceed with a sense of measured care. Roman military discipline became one of the foundations of the city's expansion. The Roman army was not simply a fighting force, but a carefully ordered institution, shaped by training, hierarchy, routine, and a shared idea of duty. A legionary did not only learn how to fight, he learned how to march, how to camp, how to build, how to obey, and how to endure long stretches of uncertainty. Soldiers helped construct roads, bridges, forts, supply lines, and fieldworks, so the army became a kind of moving engine of state power. In that sense, military service was both destructive and constructive at once. It projected Roman authority into distant landscapes, but it also left behind practical traces of Roman life. For many men, service could be harsh, exhausting, and dangerous, yet it could also provide pay, social standing, discipline, and the possibility of advancement. Over time, the army became one of the main ways Rome extended itself beyond the city. Its presence carried Roman organization into faraway regions, and in return it brought back wealth, captives, information, and influence. Many of the things most associated with Roman greatness were inseparable from this military system, which tied conquest to administration and endurance. A Roman legion was a carefully organized unit, and its structure reflected Rome's broader habit of making complexity manageable. Rather than leaving things to chance, Roman military organization broke large bodies of men into smaller groups with defined duties and clear commands. Standards, signals, and ranks gave each unit identity, while also reminding soldiers that they were part of something larger than themselves. The equipment of the legionary changed over time, but the overall impression remained one of practicality and cohesion. Helmets, shields, armor, and weapons were designed not only to protect the individual, but to make the formation work as a whole. The shield, in particular, had both a physical and symbolic role, since it helped create the famous Roman sense of collective strength. Training was repetitive and often unglamorous. Movements were practiced until they became habit, and habit became reliability. That reliability was one reason Roman armies could operate in very different environments, from mountain passes to riverfronts and open plains. They were built around a repeatable system rather than a single style of battle. This institutional steadiness is one reason the Roman legion remained so formidable in historical memory, even long after the empire itself changed shape. The Latin language began as the speech of a relatively small region, but through Roman power it became one of the most influential languages in history. Latin was used in law, administration, literature, religion, military command, and public life, so it became more than a local tongue. It became a language of authority. As Roman rule expanded, Latin spread unevenly, adapting to local customs and mixing with regional speech. In some places it remained highly formal. In others it gradually shifted into everyday forms that eventually contributed to the Romance languages. What makes Latin so remarkable is its flexibility. It could sound precise and legal, elevated and poetic, practical and bureaucratic. Authors such as Cicero and Virgil used it with extraordinary control, showing how much meaning could be shaped through careful syntax and rhythm. Even after spoken Latin changed into different regional languages, Latin remained a mark of education and prestige for many centuries. It continued to live in scholarship, religion, medicine, science, and law. In a quiet and persistent way, it became one of Rome's greatest survivals, still visible in words and phrases that modern languages continue to carry. Roman literature preserved much of the city's inner world. It gave later generations not just stories, but a way to hear how Romans argued, reflected, praised, mocked, and remembered. Epic poetry, speeches, history, satire, and philosophy all found a place in Latin writing. Poets such as Virgil, Ovid, and Horace did more than produce elegant texts. They helped shape the cultural memory of Rome itself. Virgil's Aeneid connected Rome to heroic destiny and to a long mythic past. Ovid explored transformation, desire, and uncertainty with wit and fluidity. Horace gave measured voice to reflection, restraint, and the passing of time. Prose writers such as Livy and Tacitus turned historical writing into a meditation on power, virtue, and decline. These works do not give us a perfect record of events, but they reveal how Romans wished to understand themselves. Literature became one of the city's most powerful forms of self-description. Through it, Rome learned to remember its own grandeur, to question it, and to frame it in language that later ages would inherit with admiration. Roman law grew into one of the civilization's most lasting legacies. It developed gradually through custom, statutes, judicial practice, and imperial administration, creating frameworks for property, contracts, family life, inheritance, and public authority. Roman legal thinking prized definition, procedure, and precedent, and its categories were often refined over many generations rather than invented all at once. This slow development is part of what gave the law its endurance. It could adapt to new circumstances while still preserving older forms of reasoning. Even after the political world of Rome changed, legal ideas associated with Rome continued to influence later European systems, especially in civil law traditions. This is one reason Rome remains so important in the history of institutions. A city may disappear as a governing power and still remain present in the rules that shape later societies. Roman law also reminds us that civilization is not made only of temples, roads, and palaces. It is also built through written distinctions, careful records, and the patient organization of social life. In Rome, abstract thought could be as durable as stone. The Roman calendar developed over time into a system of months, festivals, and public observances that ordered civic and religious life. Time in Rome was not simply measured by numbers. It was experienced through ritual, tradition, and public rhythm. Certain days were suitable for business, others were reserved for religious duty, legal matters, or rest. The calendar made social life feel structured and knowable, with sacred intervals and practical intervals woven together. Its months and festival cycles carried traces of older custom, even as later reforms changed their shape. Julius Caesar's reform created a more regular solar calendar, and that Julian system influenced later calendar traditions for many centuries. This matters because it shows how Roman influence reached into the ordinary act of counting days. Calendars may seem quiet and invisible, but they are forms of organization with real power. They decide when work begins, when festivals are held, when laws may proceed, and when communities pause. Rome's calendar helped shape the rhythm of life in a way that still lingers, faintly but unmistakably, in modern timekeeping. Roman triumphs were elaborate public ceremonies celebrating military victory. When granted a triumph, a general processed through the city in a highly choreographed display of power, divine favor, and civic approval. The route was filled with spectacle, spoils from the campaign, captives, images, or symbols of conquered peoples, and the commander himself in a role that was both honored and carefully controlled. The ceremony transformed military success into public memory. It told the city a story about who had won, who had been subdued, and why the victory mattered. At the same time, the triumph reminded everyone that the army served the state, not merely the ambitions of one man. These events were not only political, they were theatrical, religious, and emotional, combining celebration with a subtle awareness of the violence behind it. In that sense, the triumph was a way of making conquest visible and also making it seem orderly. Rome repeatedly turned war into ceremony and ceremony into civic narrative. The result was a public language of greatness that could also conceal the darker cost of empire. Gladiators occupy a dramatic place in the modern imagination, yet the reality of gladiatorial life was more varied and historically specific than popular images suggest. Many gladiators were enslaved people, prisoners of war, or condemned individuals, though some were free volunteers who entered the arena under contract. They trained in specialized schools and learned different styles of combat, each with particular armor, weapons, and rhythms of movement. Their contests took place in arenas and could involve strict rules, although the level of regulation likely varied from event to event and from place to place. For spectators, the games combined danger, performance, hierarchy, and emotional intensity. For Romans, they belonged to a broader culture in which public display and ritualized force were closely linked. Not every gladiator experienced the same fate, and some became admired figures, while others remained anonymous. Their history matters because it reveals a society that could prize discipline and courage even in the setting of extreme violence. The arena was one of Rome's most unsettling institutions, and also one of the most enduring in memory. It continues to fascinate because it exposes the tension between entertainment and cruelty, admiration and suffering. Roman engineering extended far beyond roads and aqueducts. The city's builders mastered concrete, arches, vaults, and domes in ways that changed architecture itself. Roman concrete, in particular, allowed for structures of unusual scale and durability. It made possible vast interiors, bridges, harbours, baths, theatres, and monumental public buildings that could hold space in new ways. The arch distributed weight efficiently, the vault extended those principles into length, and the dome created a rounded interior that still feels remarkable in places like the Pantheon. These techniques gave Roman architecture a distinctive visual language. Walls could curve, ceilings could open, and enclosed spaces could feel both massive and controlled. Engineering was one of Rome's quiet arts. It rarely announced itself in the way a statue or triumphal arch might, yet its effects lasted far longer than political spectacle. Even in ruin, Roman buildings reveal a deep understanding of load, material, and form. Their endurance has encouraged admiration for centuries, not only because they were beautiful, but because they were intelligently made. In Rome, technical knowledge became part of the city's public greatness. The city of Rome also depended on labor, much of it performed by enslaved people, freed people, workers, artisans, and migrants whose names are often less preserved than those of rulers or generals. This is essential to understanding the city honestly. The grandeur of Rome was not produced by imperial vision alone. It was sustained by countless forms of labor that made daily life possible. Households, workshops, construction sites, markets, docks, farms, and administrative offices all relied on people whose work rarely appeared in the grand narratives. Some were highly skilled, others were forced, many lived in conditions shaped by inequality and dependency. To think clearly about Rome is to hold beauty and hardship together at the same time. The city's monuments, roads, and public spaces were inseparable from the labor that built and maintained them. This does not diminish Rome's historical significance, it deepens it. Rome was not only a place of power and ceremony, it was also a place of ordinary lives, repeated tasks, and social arrangements that made empire visible. Behind the famous stone and marble stood the quiet persistence of human effort. Julius Caesar stands as one of the most recognizable figures in Roman history because his life marks a dramatic turning point between the Republic and the age of personal power. He was not simply a soldier or a politician, but a man who combined military skill, legal knowledge, public speaking, and a remarkable instinct for timing. In the crowded and competitive world of late Republican politics, Caesar learned how to move between institutions that were still functioning and ambitions that were growing too large for them. He wrote about his own campaigns in a plain, controlled style, helping to shape how later generations would imagine him. That self-presentation matters because Caesar was as interested in image as in victory. He understood that in Rome, reputation could travel as effectively as an army. His rise was connected to alliances, debts, family ties, and the instability of a political system under strain. The Republic was already stretched by inequality, military power, and rival factions before Caesar became dominant, so when his career accelerated, it did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within an atmosphere of distrust and exhaustion, where extraordinary success could seem both admirable and dangerous. His crossing of the Rubicon became a symbol of irreversible action, though the historical meaning is more nuanced than the later phrase suggests. It was less a simple dramatic gesture than a calculated choice in a moment where compromise had become nearly impossible. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE did not restore the old order. Instead, it opened the way for further conflict and the eventual emergence of imperial rule. His story is important not only as biography, but as a sign of how institutions can strain under the pressure of exceptional personalities and long-term political change. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, established a new political order after years of civil war. Rather than openly declaring monarchy, he framed his rule as restoration, peace, and careful continuity with republican forms. This allowed him to concentrate authority while preserving many familiar institutions in appearance. Augustus was exceptionally skilled at image-making, legislation, patronage, and administrative reform. He knew that symbols mattered. Titles, ceremonies, monuments, and public language could make power feel less abrupt and more acceptable. Under his rule, the city saw major building programs, a reshaping of public space, and a renewed emphasis on moral and civic order. The Augustan age became a model of imperial calm after turmoil. It was not without control or coercion, but it offered stability. Augustus' achievement was to make one-man rule seem like the natural conclusion of Roman greatness. In doing so, he changed the shape of the city forever. The Roman emperors who followed Augustus varied widely in character and reputation. Some were efficient administrators, some were culturally important patrons, and some became remembered for excess, cruelty, or instability. It is easy to imagine emperors as a single category, but the reality was more complicated and far less uniform. Imperial power moved through family lines, adoption, military support, and political maneuvering, so succession could feel uncertain even when the system appeared stable. The emperor was both a person and an institution, and those two aspects were never entirely separate. He could build, reform, neglect, inspire, or frighten, often within the same reign. Court life around the emperor included advisors, guards, servants, freedmen, petitioners, and rivals, all orbiting the center of power in a delicate balance. The imperial system made Rome feel both centralized and unpredictable. One man's temperament could shape policy, but the machinery of the state remained larger than any individual. This tension between personal rule and administrative continuity is one of the most important features of Roman history. The Pantheon is among the most remarkable buildings in the ancient world, especially because of its vast dome and open oculus. The version visible today largely dates to the imperial period under Hadrian, though it replaced earlier structures and preserves the memory of earlier dedication. Standing beneath the dome, a visitor experiences a strange mixture of shelter and openness. Light enters from above in a single round beam, moving slowly across the interior as the day changes. The room feels both immense and measured, almost like a carefully tuned instrument of stone. The dome seems to float, even though it is a massive engineering feat, made possible by Roman understanding of concrete, weight, and geometry. The Pantheon's design reflects Roman confidence in space, symmetry, and material technique. Originally dedicated to multiple gods, it also reveals the flexibility of Roman sacred architecture. The building feels both monumental and tranquil, as if it were designed to slow the pulse of anyone who entered. Its survival gives modern observers a rare chance to stand inside a room that still speaks the language of imperial ambition and mathematical grace. Hadrian's Wall in Britain reminds us that Rome's influence extended far beyond the city itself. Although the wall lies on the edge of the empire rather than in Rome proper, it represents the wider Roman world that Rome created and governed. Hadrian was interested in boundaries, administration, and the organization of space. His reign is often associated with consolidation rather than endless expansion, and that change of emphasis mattered a great deal. Empires do not only grow by reaching outward, they also endure by defining limits, maintaining roots, and managing distant provinces with patience and care. The wall itself was not just a barrier in the modern sense, but part of a broader system of military control, customs, movement, and watchfulness. Its stones suggest effort held in place over long distances. Rome's identity was therefore not only imperial in the center, but also connective at the edges. The city stood at the heart of a network of roads, forts, ports, and laws that stretched across continents. To think about Rome is to think about reach. The city's monuments were often covered in marble, but marble itself was only one part of a broader visual culture. Romans used stone, brick, stucco, paint, bronze, and precious materials to create layered effects that changed depending on light and context. Many ancient structures that now appear bare would originally have been more colorful than modern visitors expect. Statues were painted, interiors were vivid, and surfaces could shimmer with decoration. Even temples and public buildings may have appeared busier and more animated than the ruins suggest today. This means that the Rome of the imagination should not be entirely white and silent. It was often lively in color, texture, and contrast. The modern taste for bare marble can obscure the original richness of Roman spaces, and scholars continue to refine our understanding of how these buildings actually looked. In a quiet documentary sense, this is a useful reminder that history is often more alive and varied than its ruins first suggest. Mosaics were one of Rome's most durable art forms, decorating floors, walls, and private spaces with scenes made from tiny pieces of stone or glass. They could be geometric, mythological, naturalistic, or purely ornamental, and often combined several of these moods at once. Because mosaics lasted so well, they provide an intimate record of Roman taste and daily environment. They reveal what people chose to surround themselves with: patterns, animals, sea scenes, masks, landscapes, and symbols of prosperity. A mosaic floor turned movement into a visual experience. Each step crossed an artwork. In villas, bathhouses, and public buildings, mosaics created a sense of continuity between utility and beauty. They could also be playful, with images placed in corners or around thresholds, inviting the viewer to notice small details while passing through a room. They remind us that Roman art was not confined to museums in the modern sense. It was part of the surfaces people walked over, sat beside, and lived among every day. Roman statues played a similar role in shaping public memory. They were not simply decoration, but political and social presences. A statue could honor an ancestor, an emperor, a god, or an important donor, and each of these meanings would be read slightly differently depending on where the statue stood. Its placement mattered, as did its pose, inscription, and setting. In Rome, statues filled forums, basilicas, temples, and domestic spaces, creating a dense visual field of authority and remembrance. People encountered the past through stone and bronze figures that stood in silence, yet still communicated status and story. Some statues were idealized, some realistic, and some deliberately propagandistic, while others preserved the wrinkles, scars, or severe expressions of public life. Their varied forms show how the Romans used art to organize memory. A city crowded with statues is a city that tries to keep speaking long after the original voices have gone. The city's water supply did not end with aqueducts. Once water reached Rome, it had to be distributed through reservoirs, pipes, fountains, baths, and household connections. This required administration, maintenance, and ongoing attention, because a system of such size could not simply be built and then ignored. Public fountains gave many residents access to flowing water, while elite households could enjoy more private arrangements. Baths depended on a reliable supply, as did workshops, gardens, and many public services. The system was a reminder that infrastructure is not just construction, it is also care over time. A city of Rome's size depended on repeated upkeep, and the continuity of water service reflected a larger Roman ability to maintain complex systems. In a restful way, the image of water moving through stone channels suggests a civilization that understood the value of flow, pressure, and consistency. Rome did not only conquer land, it organized basic necessities into a civic art. The Romans placed great importance on public spectacle, and their festivals created repeated moments when the city could become ceremonial, noisy, and expressive. Religious festivals marked the calendar, honored gods, and renewed civic bonds. Public games mixed devotion with entertainment, and processions moved through streets as visible acts of shared identity. These events were not occasional extras, they were part of how Rome understood itself. A festival could transform ordinary space into sacred or communal space for a day. This rhythm of celebration helped bind a diverse population into a common civic world, In that sense, Rome was not only a city of stone, but a city of repeated performances. Even the pace of the year could feel choreographed, with days of labor, sacrifice, rest, and gathering unfolding in a pattern that gave order to public life. Some festivals were solemn and ancient in origin, while others grew more elaborate over time, shaped by political needs, military victories, or changing religious fashions. The details could vary, and ancient writers do not always agree on how every ritual should be understood. Still, the larger picture is clear. Rome lived through ceremonies as much as through laws. A street, a temple, or a square could briefly take on a different meaning when banners, incense, music, and crowds filled the air. In those moments, the city seemed to breathe as one body, and that shared rhythm may have been one reason Roman identity endured so powerfully for so long. The Forum of Trajan was one of the most ambitious urban projects of imperial Rome, showing how later emperors continued to shape the city through monumental architecture. Built with immense resources, it included open areas, basilicas, markets, and commemorative structures. Such projects were not only practical, they were statements that imperial power could organize space on a scale worthy of memory. Trajan is often remembered as a successful emperor, and his forum reflects a period when Rome could still imagine expansion, competence, and order together. Urban planning became a form of storytelling. Streets and buildings could say as much about a ruler as speeches or laws. Even today, the remains of such spaces suggest how carefully Rome curated its own public image. The Forum also stood within a larger architectural conversation, one that linked older republican traditions with the new language of empire. It was not simply a market or a plaza, but a carefully composed environment meant to guide movement and attention. Visitors would have encountered stone colonnades, open vistas, and enclosed rooms that shaped the experience of walking through the heart of power. Some scholars emphasize the practical functions of such complexes, while others focus on the symbolic message of scale and order. Both are important. In Rome, utility and ideology were often intertwined. A person entering Trajan's Forum was not just passing through architecture, they were moving through an argument about what Rome had become. Trajan's Column stands nearby as one of the most detailed historical monuments in Rome. Its spiraling reliefs depict scenes from Trajan's campaigns in Dacia, turning stone into narrative. The column is remarkable because it does not merely celebrate victory in an abstract way. It unfolds that victory step by step, with soldiers, forts, bridges, tools, and movements all rendered in sequence. This makes it both a monument and a visual chronicle. The column shows Roman attention to order, military organization, and imperial memory. It also demonstrates that Romans understood the power of images to teach and persuade. A viewer could read the story by looking upward, circling around, and following the carved spiral. It is one of the great examples of history being embedded in architecture. At the same time, the monument leaves room for interpretation. We can see the structure of the campaign, but not every detail of how the original audience responded. Some may have read it as propaganda, others as remembrance, and others simply as an astonishing display of craftsmanship. The column itself has endured as a rare survival of Roman narrative art on a monumental scale. Its scenes are dense but orderly, filled with motion yet controlled by composition. Even in fragmentary light, the reliefs suggest a world of disciplined labor, military routine, and imperial ambition. It is easy to imagine standing there in silence, looking up the long carved surface, and sensing how Rome turned conquest into memory. Roman baths were not only for bathing, but also for exercise, leisure, and social contact, and many complexes became major centers of urban life. The larger imperial baths could include libraries, gardens, open courtyards, and various temperature rooms. Their size was impressive, but so was their atmosphere. The baths gave Rome a way to combine comfort with collective experience. In them, the ordinary body became part of a broader civic routine. Heat, Steam, water, and stone worked together to create a distinct sensory world. The bath complex was also a place where the empire's wealth and engineering could be felt at the level of daily life. It is one thing to speak of Roman greatness in abstract terms. It is another to imagine warm air, polished surfaces, and quiet movement through a vast public interior. The bathhouse was both practical and symbolic, a place where cleanliness, sociability, and status all came into contact. Ancient sources often describe the baths with admiration, though they can also hint at crowding, noise, and social mixing. Depending on the hour, the atmosphere might be lively or restful, formal or relaxed. Some visitors came to exercise in the palaestra, some to read or converse, and some simply to enjoy the sequence of hot, warm, and cool spaces. The architecture made that sequence feel almost ceremonial. There is a reason the baths remain so evocative in the historical imagination. They offered not just sanitation, but a daily experience of Roman civilization in its most material form. The city's entertainment spaces also included theatres and theatres of memory. Roman theatres adapted Greek models, but gave them a distinctive urban place in Roman culture. Performances ranged from comedy and tragedy to more popular forms of spectacle. Theatre architecture itself mattered because it arranged sound, vision, and audience together in a controlled environment. This was a very Roman approach. The event and the setting reinforced each other. The audience did not merely watch. It was organized into a civic arrangement of sight and status. Roman taste valued public performance both as art and as social signal. The theatre therefore becomes part of Rome's larger habit of turning collective experience into architecture. In practice, theatres could be built into hillsides or supported by vast engineered structures, and their seating often reflected social hierarchy quite clearly. Senators, equestrians, citizens, and others might each have defined places, making the building itself a map of society. Performances were not always quiet or reverent by modern standards. They could be noisy, emotionally direct, and varied in tone. Still, they belonged to a culture that understood dramatized stories as part of public life. Even memory and politics could become theatrical. Victories were celebrated, moral lessons were staged, and familiar myths could be retold in ways that reflected Roman values. The result was an urban art form that joined architecture, social order, and imagination into one shared space. The city's temples connected public religion to building design in ways that remain impressive even in fragmentary form. Roman temples were often raised on podia, approached by steps, and framed by columns. Their forms could reflect Etruscan, Greek, and Roman traditions all at once. Inside, cult statues and ritual objects marked the presence of the divine. The temple was not a gathering hall in the modern sense. It was more of a sacred residence or focal point for ritual. Many temples were also tied closely to political events, victories, and vows made by leaders. As a result, Rome's religious architecture became part of its history writing in stone. A temple could commemorate a battle, celebrate a benefactor, or reinforce an official memory. Sacred buildings in Rome were rarely only sacred. The city's gods were woven into public identity, and the physical placement of temples often mattered as much as their decorative details. Some stood prominently in forums, while others anchored neighborhoods or hillsides. The surviving ruins suggest both grandeur and careful ritual purpose, though the exact meaning of each temple may not always be fully recoverable. Archaeologists continue to debate details of reconstruction, decoration, and cult practice. Even so, the overall impression remains vivid. Roman temples were designed to make religious devotion visible, durable, and connected to civic life. Their steps, columns, and altars created a quiet kind of authority, one that could endure long after the sounds of prayer and sacrifice had faded. Roman engineering made the city's public life possible, but it also shaped private comfort. Heating systems such as the hypocaust allowed warm air to circulate under floors and within walls. especially in baths and some elite homes. This was an elegant answer to a practical problem. Instead of relying only on fireplaces or open heat, Romans developed systems that could distribute warmth through enclosed spaces. Such innovation reveals how the city combined luxury and technique. The comfort was real, but it rested on complex labor and maintenance. In a documentary sleep setting, the idea of warmth moving quietly beneath a stone floor has a calming resonance. It suggests a civilization that found ways to make built spaces more livable through hidden craftsmanship. The hypocaust depended on furnaces, channels, raised floors, and constant attention, and so it was never just a simple convenience. It was an organized system, supported by workers and technical knowledge. In some buildings, this technology also shows the uneven distribution of comfort in Roman society, since the finest heating belonged to those who could afford it. Still, the principle itself is striking. The Romans were willing to alter the structure of a building in order to create an even and enveloping climate. That preference for controlled environments appears again and again in Roman life, from bathhouses to villas to elite dining rooms. The result was a built world that could feel remarkably modern in its concern for atmosphere, even though it depended entirely on ancient fuel, stone, and labor. Roman gardens offered another side of city life. Within houses, villas, and public settings, gardens could provide shade, scent, water, and visual relief from dense urban streets. They often included fountains, statues, clipped hedges, and cultivated plants. The garden created a sense of order within nature, which suited Roman preferences for design and control. At the same time, gardens could feel restful and intimate, especially when compared with the noise of political and commercial life. Elite Romans sometimes used gardens as spaces for reflection, conversation, or display. In art and poetry, gardens became symbols of peace and cultivation. They remind us that even in the center of empire, Romans sought quiet places where green life could soften stone. The vocabulary of Roman garden culture was broad. Some gardens were formal and geometric, others more shaded and seemingly natural, and some were attached to lavish houses where their beauty also signaled wealth. Planting choices could carry meaning, and water features added a sense of movement and coolness. The exact appearance of any one garden is often uncertain, since much of what survives comes from fragments, paintings, or literary descriptions rather than complete landscapes. Yet the general effect is easy to imagine. A garden in Rome might have offered a slower tempo, a place where wind moved through leaves and sunlight fell on marble or tile. In a city of hard surfaces, the garden was a carefully composed pause. Roman banquets were more than meals. They were performances of hospitality, rank, and taste. Guests reclined, courses were served carefully, and conversation was part of the experience. Elite dining could involve costly ingredients and elaborate presentation, while ordinary meals remained simpler and more practical. The banquet matters historically because it shows how Romans organized social hierarchy around shared table rituals. Even the arrangement of reclining positions could express status. At the same time, banquets were moments of intimacy and entertainment, where stories, philosophy, and politics could mingle. The Roman table was a site where the city's wider values appeared in miniature: order, display, hierarchy, and the desire to make social life feel composed. Literary sources sometimes satirize excess at these meals, especially when writers wanted to criticize luxury or moral decline. But banquets were not only occasions of indulgence. They were also structured spaces where networks could be maintained and alliances quietly formed. Music, conversation, and the sequence of dishes all contributed to the atmosphere. In some homes, the dining room itself was designed to impress, with decoration that framed the act of eating as a social event. Even when food was modest, the ritual of sharing could still carry meaning. The Roman banquet shows how deeply domestic life could be shaped by public values. It was private, but never entirely separate from status and display. The The city's neighborhoods were not all grand, and many Romans lived in crowded apartment buildings called insulae. These structures could be tall, busy, and vulnerable to fire or collapse, especially in densely packed areas. Their existence reminds us that Rome was not only a city of emperors and monumental marble. It was also a city of tenants, artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and families living in vertical proximity. The contrast between elite homes and crowded apartments is one of the most important features of urban Rome. It reveals a city of extremes, where beauty and risk coexisted, and where the daily experience of ordinary residents could be very different from the image left by surviving monuments. That difference is part of the city's truth. Insulae could have shops at street level and living quarters above, creating a constant blend of commerce and domestic life. Some were built sturdily, while others may have been less reliable, and ancient writers sometimes comment on dangers such as fire, noise, and instability. Yet these buildings were essential to the functioning of the metropolis. They housed much of the population, and they helped create the dense urban energy that made Rome feel alive. The higher one climbed, the more precarious life might become, though the exact conditions varied widely. In this way, the insula becomes a reminder that Rome's grandeur rested on everyday housing as much as on temples or forums. Beneath the famous monuments, the city was always inhabited by ordinary people living close together, carrying water, climbing stairs, opening shutters, and continuing their routines in the shadow of empire. Fire was one of the most persistent concerns in ancient Rome, and it belonged to the ordinary rhythm of the city as much as to the rare catastrophe. In a dense urban world filled with wooden roofs, narrow streets, cooking hearths, oil lamps, workshops, and closely packed homes, flame was never far away. Even a small spark could move quickly from one doorway to the next, carried by wind, clutter, or negligence. Night in particular could feel vulnerable, because darkness made vigilance harder and made every glow seem slightly uncertain. Roman life therefore developed around both the usefulness and the danger of fire. It warmed rooms, cooked meals, hardened clay, forged tools, and marked sacred rituals, yet it also demanded constant caution. The city's fire risk influenced building materials, street planning, public order, and the duties of officials. In that sense, fire was not only a physical hazard, but a quiet background force shaping the way Romans imagined urban life. The surviving stone monuments of Rome can give the impression of permanence, but everyday life in the ancient city depended on habits and materials that were much more fragile and much more easily lost. Among the best-known disasters of the ancient city is the Great Fire of 64 CE, which is closely associated with the reign of Nero. The event has been retold so often that it can sometimes feel almost legendary, yet at its center was a real urban catastrophe that caused severe destruction. Ancient writers describe the fire in differing ways, and they do not always agree on the sequence of events, the scale of the damage, or the meaning of what followed. That uncertainty is part of the historical record itself. We can say that the fire devastated large parts of Rome and led to major rebuilding, but we also have to acknowledge how quickly disaster became entangled with rumor, accusation, and political judgment. Nero's name was attached to the fire in ways that helped shape his later reputation, whether fairly or not. In memory, the event became more than a fire. It became a story about blame, authority, and the fragile trust between emperor and city. These layers of interpretation remind us that history is often preserved not as a single clean account, but as a mix of fact, fear, and later storytelling. Nero himself remains one of the most debated emperors in Roman history, partly because the surviving ancient sources are so colored by criticism. He is often remembered through images of spectacle, artistic ambition, and eventual collapse, but such a portrait can flatten a more complex reign. Nero supported performance and the arts, and he cultivated a public persona that set him apart from more restrained rulers. At the same time, His government became associated with suspicion, political tension, and instability. Ancient authors were not neutral observers, and many of them wrote with strong moral expectations about how an emperor should behave. Modern historians therefore read Nero with caution, aware that later hostility has shaped much of his image. He can appear either as a theatrical dreamer or a tyrant of excess, depending on the source. The truth likely lies in a more complicated middle ground, where cultural patronage, personal style, and political conflict all intersected. Rome under Nero offers a useful lesson in historical memory. Rulers are often remembered less as they were and more as later generations needed them to be. In that sense, Nero became a symbol onto which fears about decadence and power were projected. The Palatine Hill is one of the most evocative places in Rome because it connects the city's mythic beginnings with its imperial height. Ancient tradition linked the hill to the earliest stories of Rome, and later it became one of the most prestigious locations for elite and imperial residents. Over time, the area filled with houses, palaces, and sacred associations, creating a landscape where origin, legend, and political power sat side by side. Walking across the Palatine, one moves through layers of memory rather than a single historical moment. The ground itself seems to hold many versions of the city at once. That is part of the hill's quiet grandeur. It is not only important because emperors lived there, but because it remained tied to the idea of Rome's own beginnings. The combination of humble myth and elevated wealth is striking. A site once associated with early settlement later became a stage for luxury and rule. The Palatine therefore shows how Rome often folded its past into its present without erasing either one. It is a place where the city's identity was continually rewritten in stone, brick, and story. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House of Nero, was one of the most famous imperial residences ever built in Rome, and much of its reputation comes from the scale of its ambition. It was not simply a house in the ordinary sense. It was a sprawling complex of rooms, gardens, water features, decorated halls, and carefully designed spaces meant to express imperial magnificence. Later generations often viewed it as a symbol of extravagance, and that judgment is part of why the building became so famous. But it also reflects Roman architectural creativity and a willingness to reshape urban space around a single personality. The very fact that so much of the complex was later buried or repurposed adds to its strange atmosphere. What survives today can feel like a palace hidden beneath the city, as though Rome itself had decided to cover over an uncomfortable memory. That buried quality makes the Domus Aurea especially powerful in historical imagination. It represents both the boldness of imperial art and the instability of public approval. In ruin and concealment, it reminds us that monuments do not always endure in the form their creators intended. After the upheavals of the previous imperial period, Vespasian and the Flavian dynasty set about restoring confidence through building, administration, and visible civic renewal. Their program was practical, but it was also deeply political. A city recovering from turmoil needs more than speeches. It needs streets repaired, public spaces renewed, and structures that suggest order has returned. The Flavians understood this clearly. The Colosseum, though often discussed as a spectacle building, also belongs to this wider project of reasserting imperial legitimacy through public benefit. Its construction occupied a space once linked with Nero's private luxury, turning a symbol of imperial excess into a venue for communal entertainment. That transformation had meaning. It suggested that the emperor could give something back to the people, that what had been enclosed could now be opened, and that Rome's center could once again serve the many rather than the one. Public architecture in this context was never neutral. It was a language of recovery, a way of saying that the city had survived its disorder. The Flavian buildings thus stand not only as monuments of stone, but as quiet declarations of restored confidence. The Emperor Titus is often remembered with unusual warmth in Roman tradition, especially when compared with some of the more controversial rulers around him. His reign was short, but it became associated with compassion, diligence, and a sense of public duty. Ancient memory linked him to responses to disaster, including the eruption of Vesuvius and major fires in Rome, which helped shape the image of a ruler attentive to suffering. Titus also belonged to the larger imperial world that stretched far beyond the city itself. His role in the Jewish war and in the destruction of Jerusalem reminds us that Roman peace in the capital was supported by conquest and displacement elsewhere. That connection is important, even in a calm narrative. The splendor of Rome did not exist in isolation. It was woven together with conflict in distant provinces, with tribute, military campaigns, and the movement of resources across the empire. Titus shows how a Roman emperor could be remembered for generosity at home while presiding over events of great violence abroad. His reputation, like so many imperial reputations, is shaped by the tension between public image and imperial reality. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE did not happen in Rome itself, but it became one of the defining natural disasters of the Roman world. Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried so completely that they were preserved in astonishing detail, offering later generations a rare and intimate glimpse into Roman daily life. Streets, houses, shops, tools, frescoes, and even food remains became part of the historical record through catastrophe. For Rome, the eruption was a reminder that human power had limits. Even the reach of empire did not protect cities from volcanic force. There is something both tragic and revealing in the preservation of these places. Because they were overwhelmed so suddenly, they allow us to see the textures of ordinary existence more clearly than many surviving sites do. The Roman world appears not only in grand temples or triumphal monuments, but in small domestic arrangements and everyday routines. Though Pompeii and Herculaneum were not Rome, they belong fully to the civilization Rome represents. Their silence after the eruption is part of why they continue to speak so clearly now. The Roman Forum was more than a center of government. It was a layered public space where religion, memory, law, and ceremony all met in close proximity. Temples stood beside civic buildings, and sacred traditions were woven into political life so tightly that the two could hardly be separated. The Temple of Saturn, the shrines of Castor and Pollux, the precinct of Vesta, and other sacred structures all contributed to the forum's unique character. A citizen moving through the area would have encountered not just administration, but atmosphere, history, and ritual presence. Speeches could take place near altars. Legal matters could unfold in sight of revered shrines. The forum was therefore not a neatly divided civic square, but a living, overlapping field of authority. That mixture was typical of Rome. The city often preferred accumulation to separation, allowing different forms of power to share the same space. The result was a center that felt intensely public and deeply symbolic at the same time. Even in ruin, the Forum continues to suggest a place where Roman life was constantly negotiating between the practical and the sacred. One of the most recognizable features of Roman architecture is the arch, and its importance goes beyond style. The arch is structurally efficient, allowing weight to be redirected and openings to span greater distances than many earlier building methods permitted. Romans used arches in gateways, bridges, aqueducts, basilicas, and monumental facades, repeating the form so often that it became a visual language of its own. It conveys a sense of support without heaviness and strength without awkwardness. That is part of why it feels so enduring. A Roman arch seems to show the logic of pressure itself, as if the building is calmly explaining how it holds together. The form also became one of the empire's most influential gifts to later architecture. Centuries after Rome, builders continued to borrow the arch because it joined practicality with dignity. It could be modest or grand, decorative or purely functional. In the Roman world, that flexibility made it especially powerful. The city's repeated use of arches helped define the way people in later ages imagined classical solidity. It is one of those simple shapes that carries a very long cultural memory. Rome is also a city of reuse, and that fact gives its material history a special kind of depth. Over many centuries, stones, columns, bricks, marbles, and inscriptions were taken from older buildings and used again in new ones. This practice, often described under the broader idea of spolia, means that the city's ancient fabric was never entirely static. Material moved, meanings changed. A column from one era could support a building of another. A carved block could be built into a later wall. An inscription might survive only because someone valued the stone for its usefulness rather than for its original message. This kind of reuse makes Rome feel layered rather than fixed. The city does not present a single untouched past. Instead, it reveals a long process of selection, removal, preservation, and transformation. Some elements were cherished, some were broken, and some were simply recycled because practical needs outweighed reverence. That ongoing rearrangement is part of Rome's quiet character. It is a city where the past has often survived not by standing still, but by being carried forward into new forms. After the Western imperial period faded, Rome remained important as a religious and symbolic center, especially through the growing influence of Christianity. The city did not lose meaning when imperial administration shifted elsewhere, and in many ways that shift revealed a different kind of endurance. Instead of being defined only by emperors, armies, and civic offices, Rome gradually took on new layers of significance. Bishops, churches, pilgrims, and relics gave the city a renewed role in a changing world, and that role was deeply rooted in memory. The streets and hills that once framed imperial processions began to carry Christian stories, feast days, and sacred destinations. This continuity and reinvention are central to Rome's long history. Ancient monuments stood beside basilicas, and old forums slowly gave way to new sacred geographies. The transformation took centuries. It was not a sudden replacement of one Rome with another, but a patient reworking of the same city into new meanings. Rome learned to remain itself while becoming something else. The conversion of Constantine and the later support given to Christianity by imperial power changed the religious landscape of Rome profoundly. Churches rose in prominence, while older temples gradually lost their central civic function. Yet the transition was not a simple erasure, as if one belief system swept another away in a single motion. Roman traditions, building methods, and urban habits continued in modified forms. Even as public worship changed, the city's familiar rhythms remained. Processions, patronage, repair, ceremony, and the use of monumental space. Sacred places were reinterpreted rather than replaced all at once. A temple might survive as a standing shell, or be quarried for material, or inspire a new building nearby. This gradual transformation helps explain why Rome can feel like several cities layered on top of one another. Pagan Rome, imperial Rome, Christian Rome, and medieval Rome all coexist in the record, sometimes uneasily, sometimes harmoniously. The continuity of place outlived the continuity of belief, and that is part of what gives the city its quiet depth. The Basilica of St. Peter, though much later than ancient Rome, stands within this long transformation and demonstrates Rome's later spiritual authority. Its history belongs to a Christian world, yet the idea of a basilica itself has Roman roots in civic architecture, showing again how old forms can be adapted to new purposes. In the ancient city, basilicas were associated with law, business, and public gatherings. Their long interior spaces, their columns, and their orderly grandeur were practical as well as impressive. In Christian Rome, those same architectural qualities helped shape a sacred atmosphere of gathering and ritual. Roman buildings did not disappear from history, they changed function. That ability to repurpose space is one of the city's most durable characteristics. A hall of law or commerce could become a place of worship. A public form could gain a spiritual life. The architectural language remained familiar even when the meanings shifted, and this continuity made Rome's later monuments feel connected to something older than themselves. Their silence is not empty, it is layered. Medieval Rome was in many respects a quieter, smaller city than the imperial capital of earlier centuries. Population declined, many classical structures fell into partial ruin, and some parts of the city became rural, sparse, or overgrown. Fields, gardens, and broken walls could stand close to inhabited quarters, giving the city a discontinuous character. Yet medieval Rome was not simply a decline story, even if later writers sometimes described it that way. It was a city with its own rhythms, institutions, towers, churches, markets, and neighborhoods. Ancient remains became part of everyday life, sometimes as fortifications, sometimes as housing, and sometimes as sources of stone and brick. Colonnades might be embedded into new walls, marble might be burned for lime. The old city was not forgotten so much as folded into daily necessity. This period matters because it shows how cities can contract without disappearing. Rome's survival during these centuries depended on adaptability, memory, and the continued significance of pilgrimage and religious authority. Even in quieter times, the city retained a pulse. Pilgrimage helped keep Rome culturally alive through the Middle Ages. Travelers came from distant regions to visit holy sites, relics, and martyr traditions, linking faraway places to the city on the Tiber. For these visitors, Rome was both ancient and sacred. It was a city of apostles, saints, ruins, and stories that seemed to stretch back to the beginnings of Christian memory. Accounts of pilgrimage often mingle reverence with practical detail, noting roads, shrines, accommodations, and the difficulties of travel. In this way, the city became part of a wider devotional network. Pilgrimage also supported local economies and reinforced Rome's role as a place to be seen and remembered. Inns, markets, reliquaries, and churches all formed part of the pilgrim experience. Movement toward the city mattered just as much as movement within it. Rome remained a destination long after it ceased to be the direct center of political rule. In quiet, repeated arrivals, the city was continually renewed. The medieval towers of Rome reveal a later chapter in the city's architecture. Built by powerful families and local elites, these towers served as symbols of status and defense in a time when urban power was more fragmented. They rose among ancient ruins and newer buildings, creating a skyline very different from the imperial one. Some were sturdy and plain, others narrow and imposing, but all carried the same sense of guarded presence. Their purpose was practical and political at once. A tower could watch, shelter, warn, and declare. In a city where inherited grandeur coexisted with instability, height itself became a form of authority. Their presence illustrates how Rome could become layered not only through centuries, but through changing forms of rule and competition. The city became less about imperial uniformity and more about local families, religious influence, and survival. Standing among older stones, the towers gave the medieval city a vertical and cautious character, as if every level of urban life were aware of what had come before it. The catacombs of Rome are underground burial places associated especially with early Christian communities, though burial practices in the city were varied and changed over time. These spaces were used for interment, remembrance, and, in later centuries, devotion. Their long corridors and chambers create a solemn impression today, but they were originally practical responses to burial needs in a crowded and evolving city. Tombs, niches, inscriptions, and painted symbols all speak to a world where memory and faith were closely linked. The catacombs remind us that Roman history extends below ground as well as above it. They hold another kind of Rome, one marked by secrecy, community, and the hope of remembrance. In documentary terms, they reveal how urban life includes hidden layers beneath public monuments. They also show how the city's sacred geography expanded beyond streets and basilicas into the earth itself. Beneath the noise of the city, there was another quiet city, carved into darkness and kept alive by ritual attention. Rome's later identity as a seat of the papacy gave the city a new political and spiritual center. The Pope's authority developed over time, shaped by theological debates, imperial changes, local influence, and the slow accumulation of institutional power. As that authority grew, Rome became increasingly associated with ecclesiastical leadership on a broader scale. This created a city in which ancient imperial symbolism and Christian leadership could coexist in striking ways. The old language of empire did not vanish entirely. It was often absorbed into the language of sacred authority, processional display, and ceremonial rank. Even the idea of Rome as a universal center could be reimagined through the church. This continuity helps explain why Rome has remained such a potent image in Western history. It is a city that learned to survive by changing who spoke for it and by redefining what centrality meant. The seat of power was no longer the throne of an emperor alone. It was also the chair of a bishop, the altar of a church, and the memory of apostolic succession. Roman ruins inspired artists, scholars, and travelers for centuries. Even when structures were damaged, incomplete, or partly buried, they continued to stimulate imagination. The broken column, the half-buried arch, the cracked inscription, and the shadow of an amphitheatre all became part of a long visual tradition. People projected ideals and melancholy onto ruins, seeing in them both loss and endurance. Some admired them as lessons in the rise and fall of power. Others drew them as exercises in beauty, proportion, or antiquity. Rome became the archetypal ruin city in European culture, though it is also a living city where people worked, prayed, and slept among remains. The beauty of ruin lies partly in its invitation to contemplate time at a slower pace. In Rome, that contemplation is especially strong because the city itself seems to preserve time in layers. A ruin is not only what has ended, it is also what remains, what is used, and what is remembered. The city's broken stones can feel almost conversational, as if they speak softly across centuries. Renaissance Rome brought renewed artistic and architectural energy to the city. Popes and patrons commissioned churches, palaces, frescoes, courtyards, bridges, and public works that reshaped the urban landscape. Artists and architects looked to antiquity for inspiration, yet they created new forms rather than mere copies. They studied ruins, measured proportions, and absorbed classical ideals, but they also adapted them to Christian and papal ambitions. This period gave Rome some of its most famous visual riches and helped establish it once again as a center of artistic achievement. Streets were widened in some places, ceremonial routes were emphasized, and new buildings created fresh focal points within the old city. The Renaissance did not erase the ancient city, it conversed with it. That conversation is visible in the way later buildings frame older remains, borrow from classical language, or stand in deliberate proximity to antiquity. Rome is one of the best places in the world to see how the past can become active material for a new present, not as a relic alone, but as a source of form and memory. The city's fountains became part of that later visual identity. In Rome, water returned as sculpture, movement, and urban ornament. Fountains often drew on restored aqueducts and were commissioned by powerful patrons who wanted to mark a square, a palace front, or a public space with beauty and symbolic order. They turned practical water access into public art. Some fountains celebrated abundance, others papal authority, and others the simple miracle of fresh water in a warm city of stone. The sound of water softening marble and travertine made the city feel more alive, and fountains became places where art and utility met calmly. Their basins, masks, statues, and carved edges invite the eye to linger. Even today, Rome is known for its fountains not only because they are beautiful, but because they continue an old Roman habit, making infrastructure visible, graceful, and communal. A fountain can be a destination, a pause, a marker in the urban rhythm. It cools the air, reflects the light, and gives the city a gentler voice. The layered history of Rome can be understood almost as a conversation between use and meaning. A wall may be ancient, but its later doorway may be medieval. A column may have belonged to a temple and later support a church. A street may trace an older route even as its buildings shift around it. The same stones can serve different eras without losing all trace of their earlier lives. This makes Rome less like a frozen museum and more like a slow archive of living adaptation. To move through the city, whether in person or in thought, is to pass through centuries that never fully leave each other behind. The Roman city is not built on a single layer of history, but on many, each one partly visible, partly hidden, and partly reimagined. That is one of Rome's deepest facts, and one of the reasons it continues to feel inexhaustible. The Vatican lies within Rome and became one of the most important centers of Christian art, ceremony, and scholarship. Though distinct in modern political terms, it belongs to the city's larger historical fabric. Its presence adds another layer to Rome's identity, one shaped by religion, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. The Vatican's collections and buildings have made Rome a global destination for art and learning, reinforcing the city's long role as a place where material beauty and authority meet. This is another example of Rome's habit of gathering power into physical space. In its courtyards, chapels, libraries, and galleries, one senses how institutions can become landscapes, and how belief can be translated into stone, paint, and ritual. Even the approach to the Vatican feels carefully composed, as though the city were guiding visitors toward a threshold between the worldly and the sacred. For centuries, pilgrims, scholars, envoys, and ordinary travelers have moved through this part of Rome with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. The area is not only a seat of governance, but also a place where memory is curated with great intention. Its influence reaches far beyond its walls, yet those walls themselves remain part of Rome's remarkable habit of concentrating history in one walkable space. The Sistine Chapel is later than ancient Rome, yet it stands within the same city of layers. Its frescoes by Michelangelo and other artists belong to a different historical world, but they participate in Rome's long tradition of monumental art. The chapel is a reminder that the city's importance did not end with antiquity. Instead, Rome continued to attract the greatest artistic minds of later centuries. The result is a city where one can move from Republican ruins to papal grandeur in a single day. Such continuity of cultural prestige is rare and helps explain why Rome feels so enduring. The chapel itself is often discussed in terms of artistic triumph, but it is also a working ceremonial space, which gives it a particular depth. It is not simply a museum room preserved behind glass. It is a living chamber of election, liturgy, and expectation, where silence can feel unusually thick. Visitors often look upward in near stillness, studying the frescoes as if they were a vast visual manuscript. The crowded scenes, the vivid bodies, the dramatic movement of prophets and ancestors all seem to gather human history into one enclosed ceiling. And yet the room remains modest in scale compared with its fame, which perhaps makes its splendor even more concentrated. Rome has many such places where size and significance do not quite match in obvious ways, and that tension is part of the city's quiet power. Rome's modern streets still often follow the logic of older routes, and this makes the city especially rich for those interested in urban continuity. Narrow roads, piazzas, and building alignments can echo older patterns even when the original structures are gone. Cities preserve movement as much as they preserve monuments. In Rome, the path of travel can be as historically revealing as a temple or statue. This is why the city rewards slow walking. Each corner may contain a trace of earlier decisions, earlier walls, or earlier uses of space. Some streets narrow where ancient ownership lines once mattered, while others open into broad squares shaped by later planning but still constrained by old topography. One often senses that Rome has been adapted rather than replaced. It has absorbed new eras without fully erasing the habits of the old city beneath them. Even the irregularity can feel legible once one accepts that urban form is a kind of historical sediment. To walk in Rome is to move through a layered arrangement of intentions, accidents, rebuildings, and survivals. The city does not always announce its continuity clearly, but it offers it patiently to anyone willing to notice how a road bends, where a facade aligns, or why a square feels oddly proportioned. In that sense, the modern city remains in conversation with the ancient one. Many Roman sites were excavated gradually over centuries, and archaeology became one of the means by which the city understood itself anew. Excavation changed how people saw ruins, inscriptions, and buried structures. It also revealed that the city's ground was dense with historical material. Layers of dirt, rubble, and construction told stories that written sources could not fully capture. Archaeology in Rome is therefore not merely a scholarly exercise. It is a way of listening to the earth beneath the city. The ground itself becomes a document. In some places, buildings have been raised, lowered, or rebuilt so many times that a single location contains several historical moments at once. Streets may pass above ancient masonry, while cellars preserve fragments of earlier walls, drainage systems, or domestic floors. This gives Rome a particular archaeological atmosphere. Discovery is not confined to distant ruins in open fields, but woven into everyday urban life. Scholars have had to piece together the city carefully, sometimes through chance finds, sometimes through planned excavation, often through patient comparison of broken remains. There is humility in this work, because so much has been lost, shifted, or repurposed. Yet there is also wonder in the fact that the city keeps yielding evidence. A column base, a shard, a mosaic fragment, a buried foundation line can alter the understanding of a neighborhood. Rome's past is not sealed away. It persists just below the surface, waiting in layers. Coins are among the smallest and most useful artifacts in Roman history. They carried portraits, slogans, symbols, and state messages. A coin passed through many hands and could travel far from its place of minting. This made coinage a practical instrument of economy and a medium of imperial communication. Emperors used coins to present their image throughout the empire. Gods, victories, and virtues also appeared on the surfaces of these small objects. To hold a Roman coin is to hold a tiny piece of public identity, one that was designed to move quietly through daily exchange. The metal may be worn smooth by time, but the messages remain striking: authority, abundance, legitimacy, conquest, or piety. Because coins circulated so widely, they helped standardize both economic life and political imagination. A person in a distant province could encounter the emperor's face without ever seeing Rome itself. That made coinage a kind of portable presence. It also makes coins exceptionally valuable to historians, since they can reveal changes in iconography, titles, and economic conditions with great precision. Some issues were produced in abundance, while others are scarce and difficult to interpret. Dates, mints, and designs can still be debated, yet even in their uncertainty, these small discs offer an intimate link to the practical rhythms of Roman life: payment, saving, tribute, and trade. They remind us that empire was also handled in the palm of a hand. Inscriptions are equally important because they preserve names, dedications, laws, and commemorations in a direct and durable form. A carved inscription can be more immediate than a literary text because it often speaks in the voice of the event itself. Tombstones, honorific bases, building records, and official declarations all help reconstruct Roman life. The city is full of silent texts if one learns how to read them. They remind us that Rome valued public memory not only in grand narratives, but also in letters cut into stone. There is something methodical and almost intimate about an inscription. It may announce a gift, record a magistrate's office, honor a military achievement, or identify the deceased in terms of family and rank. In a society attentive to status, these details mattered deeply. The carving itself could be formal and restrained, or crowded and elaborate, depending on purpose and budget. Scholars often rely on abbreviation, damaged lines, and standardized formulas to recover meaning from fragments. Sometimes only a few letters survive, enough to suggest a name or office, but not enough to settle every question. That uncertainty is part of the discipline of reading Rome. The city speaks in partial sentences, yet those sentences are often enough to restore a vanished person to the historical record. Inscriptions also make the ancient city feel unexpectedly conversational, as though voices from long ago still stand in public places, waiting quietly for someone to decipher them. Roman identity was expressed through ritual gestures, family traditions, and public memory as much as through law or architecture. Ancestors were celebrated through masks, portraits, funerals, and memorial practices. These customs linked the living to the dead and kept civic continuity visible. Rome often seems to have been a city preoccupied with lineage, and for good reason. To belong was to inherit stories. This gives Roman culture a reflective quality. The city looked backward often, not because it was static, but because memory gave legitimacy to change. Family homes and elite processions could become theatres of remembrance, where the names of forebears were preserved with care. Even public office was often framed in relation to inherited reputation. In such a world, the past was not abstract. It was carried in objects, gestures, and repeated occasions. Funerals, anniversaries, and ancestral display were ways of making continuity visible to the community. They also reinforced the idea that personal achievement should be understood within a wider chain of obligation. Roman tradition could be severe, but it was also stabilizing. It helped people orient themselves in a city that was always changing, and it created a sense that the present was never entirely separate from what had gone before. That habit of remembrance still shapes the way Rome is imagined today. The practice of adopting heirs, especially among elites and emperors, played an important role in Roman political continuity. Adoption allowed families to preserve names, estates, and alliances, and it could also offer a method of selecting capable successors. Several famous emperors were chosen or treated as heirs through adoption rather than direct birth alone. This flexibility helped stabilize succession in some periods. It also shows that Roman power could be more procedural than personal, even when it appeared dynastic. Succession was a practical problem, and Rome developed creative solutions. Adoption could carry emotional, legal, and political meanings all at once. It could knit together different branches of elite society, create alliances between households, and provide a framework for legitimacy when natural heirs were absent or unsuitable. In imperial history, adoption sometimes produced remarkably effective rulers, though not every arrangement succeeded. The system depended on trust, reputation, and calculation, which made it both adaptable and fragile. It is one of the city's clearest examples of institutional improvisation. Rather than relying only on bloodline, Rome could formalize chosen continuity. That is a very Roman kind of compromise, practical without being casual. It suggests a civilization willing to shape inheritance into something useful, even if the result looked unusual by later standards. Behind the imperial drama was often a sober administrative logic, concerned less with romance than with stability. Roman education emphasized rhetoric, literature, memory, and public speaking, especially for elite males preparing for civic life. A skilled speaker could influence courts, assemblies, and social standing. Education therefore connected private learning with public power. Children studied texts, practiced declamation, and absorbed cultural models from both Latin and Greek traditions. In this world, the ability to speak well was a form of authority. It shaped politics, law, and social reputation. The Roman classroom was one of the quieter engines of empire. The curriculum trained not only the voice, but also attention, recall, and disciplined expression. Students were expected to repeat, imitate, compare, and argue with precision. Greek authors were often admired alongside Latin ones, which gave Roman education a broad literary horizon. The goal was not simply knowledge for its own sake, but readiness for participation in civic life. Oratory could open doors in legal disputes and public office, while literary familiarity signaled refinement and rank. Yet this educational culture was also exclusionary, since access depended heavily on wealth and social position. Still, the ideal itself reveals much about Roman values. A person was meant to become persuasive, measured, and prepared. Learning was not hidden away from the city. It was intended to reappear in the forum, the courtroom, and the household. In that sense, the classroom helped shape the public voice of Rome. The city's long survival also depended on its symbolic power in art and literature. Painters, poets, architects, and later filmmakers returned to Rome because it offered a visual language already saturated with meaning. Columns, arches, busts, forums, and domes became shorthand for civilization itself, but the city is richer than its symbols. Its real history includes water, labor, law, faith, and daily endurance. The symbols endure because they rest on a deeper material and human foundation. Rome remains evocative precisely because so many layers of meaning have gathered there without fully cancelling one another. A single view can suggest empire, decay, sanctity, and resilience all at once. Artists have found in the city a setting that seems to arrive preloaded with memory. Writers, too, have often treated it as a place where time is visible in the streets. Yet the symbolic city is always supported by the practical city, by workers maintaining roads, by officials administering districts, by gardeners, artisans, pilgrims, shopkeepers, and residents carrying life forward. Without those ordinary continuities, the grand imagery would not hold. Rome's iconography works because the city has repeatedly renewed the material basis for its own myth. That balance between image and infrastructure is one of its most enduring qualities. To think about Rome slowly is to notice how often the city turns practical needs into lasting forms. Roads become history, water becomes architecture, law becomes tradition, ruin becomes beauty, and memory itself becomes part of the landscape. That is why Rome can feel both monumental and intimate, ancient and still active all at once. Its great facts are not only about conquest or empire, they are about persistence, adaptation, and the patient accumulation of city life. Many of Rome's most famous features began as answers to ordinary demands: how to move people, how to store water, how to honor the dead, how to organize authority, how to preserve prestige. Over time, these answers became visible structures, and those structures became symbols. The city's genius lies partly in this transformation, in the way function gradually acquires meaning and then survives as heritage. Even now, Rome invites a calm kind of attention. One can study it through architecture, food, ceremony, excavation, or simply the shifting texture of its streets. Each approach reveals that the city is not a single achievement, but a long conversation between necessity and imagination. Rome's cuisine today carries echoes of its very long past, though of course it has changed enormously over time. Modern Roman food is shaped by later centuries of regional tradition, seasonal produce, and the city's constant exchange with visitors, migrants, merchants, and neighboring towns. In that sense, a meal in Rome is never only a meal. It is also a quiet record of movement, adaptation, and survival. Ancient Romans ate differently from people in the city now, with different staples, different flavors, and different habits of dining, yet the deeper pattern remains familiar. Rome has always been a place where ingredients arrived from elsewhere, where tastes were influenced by contact, and where daily life carried traces of many worlds at once. Even the simplest plate can feel layered with time. A bowl of pasta in a neighborhood trattoria belongs to a much later age, but it still sits inside a city shaped by roads, trade, empire, and exchange. Meals continue to tell the story of place, and in Rome they do so with remarkable patience. The Tiber Island, resting in the middle of the river, has long been a small but distinctive part of Rome's geography. It is easy to overlook at first, especially in a city filled with monuments, yet its presence has always been meaningful. Islands often gain practical and symbolic importance in urban settings, and this one became especially associated with healing, crossing, and refuge. In ancient times it was linked with a sanctuary to Aesculapius, the god of healing, and that association gave the island a lasting identity that outlived the old religious world. The Tiber itself carried boats, boundaries, and memories. It shaped where the city could grow, where it needed bridges, and where water might be useful or dangerous. In quieter moments, the river seems to move at its own thoughtful pace, as if it has watched too much history to hurry. The island in its center feels almost like a pause in the flow, a small resting place set into the middle of the city's long current. Rome's bridges are another sign of continuity. Bridges connect not only districts and riverbanks, but also different periods of the city's life. In a place shaped by water and uneven ground, they mattered enormously from the beginning. They made movement possible, allowed trade and ceremony to continue, and helped turn the river from a barrier into a route. Some ancient Roman bridges survived in altered form, while others were rebuilt, repaired, or replaced over the centuries as the city changed around them. That repeated act of joining reflects something deeply Roman. A bridge is a structure of practical necessity, but it is also a gentle symbol of relation. It says that what is separate can be linked, and that a city can hold more than one shore at once. Rome itself has often done that. It linked old and new, sacred and civic, local and imperial, sturdy and elegant. In that sense, every bridge feels slightly like a summary of the city's character, quiet, functional, enduring, and full of memory. The modern city contains traffic, movement, and public life that would have been unrecognizable to ancient Romans, yet beneath buses, storefronts, and apartment blocks, old alignments still persist. Rome is not a preserved relic. It is a working city, full of errands, routines, noise, and contemporary habits. People go to work, children travel to school, cafes open in the morning light, and modern life unfolds beside walls that have already outlived many centuries. This is part of what makes Rome so unusual. The past is not sealed behind glass here. It sits in the same streets people still use every day. A modern intersection may follow an older line. A church may stand near the remains of a temple. A basement may contain older masonry hidden beneath newer floors. There is something quietly remarkable about a place where history remains inhabited rather than merely displayed. Few cities allow so long a conversation between eras in the same compact space. Rome does, and that is part of its enduring wonder. Public squares or piazzas became especially important in later Rome as places of gathering, meeting, and observation. They continued the city's old habit of civic visibility, even though their forms differed from the ancient forum. In a square, people can pause without needing a formal reason. They can pass through, watch, speak, wait, or simply sit and let the scene unfold around them. That openness gives piazzas a restful quality, but also a social one. They gather movement into shared space and make the city easier to read. In Rome, these squares are often framed by churches, palaces, fountains, and older walls, so they feel naturally layered. A person standing in one can sense that many ages have used the same openness for different purposes. Markets may once have filled the space, or processions, or public conversation, and later the square becomes a place for visitors, neighbors, and daily urban routines. The result is a setting that feels both stable and alive, a calm center where architecture and human presence meet with very little effort. Rome's artistic heritage includes frescoes that decorate interiors with color, myth, illusion, and landscape. Fresco painting allowed walls to become more than barriers. It invited them to suggest depth, air, and movement, turning solid surfaces into quiet visual worlds. In Roman domestic spaces, Wall paintings could create the impression of gardens, columns, architectural vistas, or scenes from story and memory. This was a remarkable kind of art because it joined precision with imagination. The painter worked onto wet plaster, making the process both deliberate and limited by timing, yet the result could feel spacious and free. A painted wall might soften the enclosure of a room and imply that life extended beyond it. Even when much of the original color has faded, surviving frescoes still carry a delicate atmosphere. They remind us that the Roman world cared not only about building with stone, but also about shaping feeling. In a gentle sense, frescoes turn architecture into mood, and a room into a place of quiet passage. The city also preserves memories of rulers through monuments, inscriptions, and later historical writing. Some emperors were praised for stability, others criticized for vanity, cruelty, or overreach, but all entered the long civic memory of Rome. Their names appear on columns, arches, coins, and buildings, and even where a monument is gone, the historical record often keeps the figure alive. Rome remembers leadership in a very physical way. Stone can praise, commemorate, or accuse. An inscription can outlast the intentions that created it, yet the city never belongs only to its rulers. For every emperor remembered in marble, there were countless ordinary people whose labor, movement, belief, and endurance made urban life possible. Artisans, laborers, merchants, soldiers, families, clerks, and travelers all took part in the city's daily making. History becomes fuller when both levels are held together, the public names that survived and the quieter lives that kept the city functioning. Rome's monuments may celebrate power, but its deeper story includes the many people whose names did not remain carved in stone. One of Rome's greatest strengths was its ability to organize diverse populations under a common framework. This did not erase difference, it did not remove inequality, and it certainly did not prevent conflict. But it did create a legal and cultural structure that could extend over an enormous territory. Roads connected distant regions, laws created shared expectations, coinage helped commerce, and military presence supported imperial reach. Language also played a major role, especially Latin in the western parts of the empire, though local languages and customs remained present in many areas. Rome thus became less a single city than a pattern repeated in province after province. Its capital was the symbolic center of a distributed order, and that order could be adapted, borrowed, argued over, and reshaped. Historians still study this capacity with admiration and caution. It was powerful, and it was not simple. Yet its scale remains astonishing. Rome made unity possible across great distance, though always imperfectly, and that achievement shaped much of later European and Mediterranean history. The city's churches, palaces, museums, and ruins continue to attract scholars because they hold evidence from many periods at once. Rome is not a one-story city. It is a deeply layered archive in built form. One wall may belong to antiquity, another to the Middle Ages, another to the Renaissance, and another to modern preservation. A single neighborhood can contain traces of pagan ritual, Christian devotion, aristocratic display, and contemporary tourism. That breadth is one reason the city supports endless study. It can be approached from architecture, politics, religion, daily life, art, engineering, urbanism, or myth, and each path opens onto another. A scholar may come looking for an inscription and discover a street pattern. Another may study a church and find reused stone from older structures. Another may follow a legend into a historical pattern that cannot be fully confirmed. Rome resists being summarized too quickly because it has been formed by so many overlapping human intentions. The city invites patience. It rewards careful looking. And it reminds us that history is often not a straight line, but a series of layers that remain partly visible to one another. That is perhaps Rome's most restful fact at this late stage of the journey. It is a city that allows the mind to wander slowly from one layer to the next without needing to hurry. Stone, water, law, memory, and faith all remain within reach, each one carrying its own weight and its own kind of silence. Even the contradictions feel settled into place. Ancient and modern, grand and ordinary, permanent and changing, all coexist in a way that seems to ask for calm attention rather than immediate resolution. As the evening deepens, the city's long history can feel less like a chain of dramatic events and more like a quiet landscape of time. There is room here for lingering thought, room for old names to rest beside present streets, room for the river to keep moving without interruption. And in that gentle continuity, Rome remains itself. In the later centuries of the Roman world, one of the most quietly revealing developments was the rise of the wine and olive estates that spread across the countryside around the city and throughout the wider empire. These were not just farms in the simple sense, but carefully managed landscapes of production, storage, labor, and transport. The olive press, with its slow-turning stones and heavy wooden beams, would have created a steady rhythm in the air, while wine was left to ferment in great jars, sometimes in cool cellars dug into the earth. Olive oil lit lamps, flavored food, treated wounds, and filled amphorae for trade. Wine traveled even farther, crossing seas and roads in sealed containers marked by stamps, names, and cargo notes that modern archaeologists still study. Around Rome itself, the countryside held a web of villas and agricultural estates whose prosperity depended on slave labor, tenant farmers, and seasonal workers, though the exact balance changed over time and by region. Some estates were run by wealthy elites who lived far from the fields, while others were more modest, tied closely to local markets. What is striking is how much of Roman comfort rested on these quiet rural systems. The city's fountains, households, taverns, and temples all depended, in one way or another, on the repetitive work of the land, work that unfolded far from the marble monuments usually remembered in history. Linked to that agricultural world was the Roman system of grain supply, perhaps one of the most important logistical achievements of the ancient Mediterranean. Rome grew into a city that could not feed itself from the land immediately around it, and so it relied on vast shipments of grain, especially from North Africa and Egypt in later periods. Grain was measured, stored, transporting, and distributed with remarkable administrative care, though not perfectly and not without interruption. The annona, the public grain supply, became a powerful symbol of the state's responsibility to the urban population. In the harbour at Ostia and later at Portus, ships unloaded sacks and bulk cargo, which were then moved up the river and into massive storage buildings. Grain warehouses, or horia, were among the most practical structures in Rome, thick-walled and carefully designed to keep supplies dry and safe. Bread and porridge formed the basis of many diets, and the state's efforts to provide grain helped prevent unrest in a city that could easily become anxious when deliveries were delayed. Ancient writers sometimes spoke of grain shortages as moments of political tension, when rumor moved faster than fact. Yet the system mostly worked through countless unglamorous actions: measuring, carrying, stacking, tallying, sealing, and guarding. In that sense, the empire's power was not only in its legions or emperors, but in its patient ability to feed a crowd. As Rome expanded and then settled into a more complex imperial society, the city itself became a place of dense craft production. Potters, metalworkers, leatherworkers, dyers, carpenters, and builders all worked in neighborhoods shaped by smell, noise, smoke, and the constant movement of materials. Archaeological traces of workshops are often fragmentary, but they suggest a city alive with specialized labor. In some districts, ceramic kilns fired red-hot through the night, leaving behind cracked bricks and stacks of discarded vessels. In others, bronze might have been melted and recast, or textiles dyed with expensive substances that left stains on hands and vats. Many artisans worked near markets, ports, or roads where goods could move easily. Some were free citizens, some freed people, and some enslaved, and the social status of a craft could vary greatly depending on the product and the client. Luxury items for elite households existed alongside the ordinary repairs and replacements that made daily life possible. A broken pot, a worn sandal, a bent hinge, a damaged lamp. These small objects tell us that Rome was not sustained only by splendor, but by repair. The city's greatness depended on thousands of hands making and remaking things, often without leaving their names behind. That same city was also filled with the sounds and routines of entertainment, and one of the most enduring institutions was the Roman bath complex. Baths were not merely places to wash, though cleansing mattered. They were social spaces where time slowed down and the body moved through stages of heat, rest, and refreshment. Entering a bathhouse, a person might pass from changing rooms into warm chambers, then into hot air heated by the hypocaust system beneath the floors, and finally into cooler spaces for immersion or relaxation. Marble, mosaics, painted walls, and echoes would have given these buildings a sense of calm grandeur, even when crowded. Wealthier bath complexes included libraries, exercise courts, gardens, and snack vendors, creating a kind of everyday leisure center. The ritual of bathing crossed class lines more than many other Roman experiences, though not everyone entered on equal terms. Some baths were free, others charged a modest fee, and the finest spaces still reflected social distinctions in dress, conversation, and access. Writers sometimes commented on the mixture of public intimacy and public performance that baths encouraged. There is something almost modern in that atmosphere. The sensation of steam, the murmur of conversation, the measured pace of people moving from one room to another. For many Romans, the bath was less a luxury than a familiar end to the day. Not far from that world of steam and water was another major feature of Roman life, the circus and the races. The Circus Maximus in Rome was enormous, long enough to hold tens of thousands, perhaps many more, though ancient figures are difficult to verify. Here, chariots thundered around the central barrier, the spina, with drivers leaning forward and reins wrapped around their bodies for balance. Teams were identified by colors, and those colors became the focus of intense public loyalty. A race was short in duration, but it carried a dense charge of emotion, money, and status. Bookmakers, fans, owners, trainers, and drivers all participated in a world where a skilled charioteer could become famous across the empire. Some were slaves or former slaves who rose through talent, while others accumulated wealth and celebrity. The soundscape of the circus must have been overwhelming. Hooves, wheels, shouts, trumpets, and the surging reaction of the crowd as each turn approached. Ancient authors sometimes viewed this enthusiasm with suspicion, seeing it as a distraction from more serious civic life. But the races clearly mattered because they created a shared urban spectacle. Even emperors understood this. Public favor could be shaped in arenas of noise and excitement, and the circus became one of the places where Roman identity was felt most collectively, if only for a few roaring laps. Alongside racing and baths, the Romans also developed elaborate practices of honor and memory in their public spaces. Statues were everywhere in the city, on forum squares, in basilicas, near temples, inside wealthy houses, and along roads leading into the city. Some represented gods, some emperors, some victorious generals, and some local benefactors who had paid for public works. These statues were not silent decorations. They communicated rank, virtue, favor, and memory. A bronze portrait could suggest endurance. A marble figure might evoke ideal beauty or ancestral authority. In some cases, statues were reused, recut, or reinscribed as power changed hands, making them part of a living political landscape rather than fixed monuments. The Romans also displayed ancestral masks and portrait busts, especially among elite families, reinforcing the idea that the dead remained part of public identity. Yet not all commemoration was permanent. Some honors were stripped away after disgrace, and political memory could be deliberately erased. The phrase later used by scholars, damnatio memoriae, captures this impulse, though the ancient evidence is more complicated than the phrase suggests. Still, the basic idea is clear. Roman public space was a conversation between presence and absence, between those remembered and those quietly removed. Walking through the city, one would have felt surrounded not only by buildings, but by layers of authority trying to outlast time. Time itself was something Romans measured in practical and ceremonial ways, and their calendar reveals a society attentive to religion, agriculture, and civic rhythm. Months were shaped by festivals, market days, and days marked for legal or ritual activity. Certain dates were favorable for business or public action, while others were reserved for sacred observance or caution. The Roman calendar changed over centuries, especially as political power and astronomical understanding evolved, and the later Julian reform under Julius Caesar brought greater regularity to the year. Yet even after reforms, the calendar remained deeply social. It governed when courts met, when sacrifices were offered, when armies marched, and when families marked anniversaries. Many of the month names still used today preserve Roman origins, though not always in exactly the way people expect. The calendar also carried traces of older agricultural life, with festivals tied to planting, harvesting, and the turning of seasons. This created a layered sense of time, where official order and older custom coexisted. A Roman could inhabit a world where the next hour mattered for a court case, the next festival for a god, and the next season for the land. The modern feeling that time is abstract and mechanical had not yet fully taken hold. Instead, Roman time was lived through ritual repetition, public announcements, temple observance, and the slow return of familiar dates. Religious life in Rome was similarly woven into everyday routines rather than confined to isolated moments of belief. Household shrines, or Narration, often held images of the household gods and ancestors, watched over cooking, storage, birth, and the ordinary concerns of domestic space. In the home, a small offering of wine or incense could connect a family to a larger sacred order. Public religion was even more elaborate, with priests, augurs, festivals, processions, and sacrificial animals. The Romans were often concerned less with personal inner faith in the modern sense than with right action, correct ritual, and maintaining harmony with divine powers. If the gods were honored properly, the community might expect protection, success, or simply stability. If a ritual was performed incorrectly, it could be repeated. This practical relationship with the divine gave Roman religion a distinctive texture. Temples were not merely houses of prayer, but places where civic identity met divine presence. Even private devotion often reflected public expectations. Over time, the empire absorbed many local deities and practices, adding them to a broad and flexible religious landscape. That openness was one reason Roman religion could feel so varied from one neighborhood or province to another. Yet beneath the diversity lay a shared conviction that the world was sustained by careful exchange between humans and gods, a kind of quiet agreement renewed through daily acts. As the imperial centuries advanced, Rome also became a city of increasingly visible Christian communities, and this transformation unfolded gradually rather than all at once. Early Christians in Rome met in homes, burial spaces, and smaller gatherings that left fewer traces than the monumental temples and public buildings of earlier centuries. At times they were tolerated, at times mistrusted, and at times persecuted, though the extent and nature of persecution varied across reigns and local circumstances. The story is often told in dramatic terms, but the historical reality was more uneven. Many Romans continued traditional practices even as Christian ideas spread through households, social networks, and charitable institutions. With the eventual conversion of emperors and the growth of ecclesiastical authority, churches became more prominent in the urban landscape. Yet Rome did not instantly abandon its older identity. Instead, the city layered new sacred spaces onto old ones, and many buildings, customs, and processions adapted over time. Christian basilicas rose near or upon earlier sites of memory, and the language of sanctity began to shape the city in new ways. The change was profound, but it was also incremental, lived through generations. In that long transition, one can sense the slow turning of history itself, old lamps still burning, new prayers being spoken, and a city learning to carry more than one past at a time. By the later empire, the city's political and physical center of gravity had also shifted in subtle ways. Rome remained symbolically important, but emperors increasingly governed from other cities closer to frontiers, military routes, or administrative needs. Ravenna, Milan, Trier, and later Constantinople each played roles that diluted Rome's direct imperial centrality. This did not mean Rome became unimportant overnight. Far from it. The city still carried immense prestige, ancestral authority, and ceremonial weight. But the mechanisms of power were no longer concentrated there in the same way they once had been. Senators, officials, bishops, and aristocrats continued to live and influence events in Rome, yet many crucial decisions were made elsewhere. The empire had become too large, too geographically stretched, and too politically complex to be managed from a single urban heart. This shift can be felt in architecture, in administrative records, and in the movement of elites across the map. For the people who remained in Rome, the result was a city at once ancient and changing, still filled with echoes of universal rule, but also adapting to a new political reality. The old capital did not simply fade, it transformed into a place of memory, ritual, and continued residence, a city whose greatness was now partly its ability to outlast the very structures that had made it supreme. And in the end, perhaps one of the most enduring facts about Rome is that its history survives not only in famous monuments, but in fragments, thresholds, inscriptions, broken pottery, and the quiet work of scholars piecing together lives from partial evidence. Much of what we know comes from objects unearthed in layers of earth, from texts copied and recopied, from coins dropped and never recovered, from graffiti scratched onto walls, and from later writers who sometimes admired Rome, sometimes criticized it, and often misunderstood it. The city is both more certain and more elusive than it first appears. Some details are securely known, while others remain debated. The number of inhabitants in different periods, the exact shape of certain neighborhoods, the daily routine of ordinary families, and the full social meaning of many rituals are all subjects of careful scholarly discussion. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story of Rome, it is part of its depth. A city so old and so crowded with memory cannot be fully recovered in a simple line or image. Instead, it settles around us in layers, like dust in lamplight, gradually forming a picture that is always partial, always textured, and always open to new discovery. That may be one of Rome's most calming truths, that its past is vast enough to hold mystery, and that even now, after so many centuries, it still invites us to listen quietly as the fragments arrange themselves into history.